Hello everyone and welcome back. In the last lesson we have created the session token and we have added it to a cookie. Now whenever we refresh the browser, the cookie is going to be sent to the server. So if the server wants to know to which user a given HTTP request belongs to, it's a matter of inspecting the cookie because the information is available there. And it's verifiable because it's a JSON web token that we have inside the cookie, so we can check the signature. Once the HTTP request hits the server and before running any application code, there are two things that we want to do with the cookie. The first thing that we want to do is to determine which user the request belongs to, and we want to make sure that the session is still valid. Once we have the information about the user, then we want to decide if we want to grant access or not to a given route. These are two different things: user ID extraction and access decision. To better understand this, let's give an example. Let's take the lessons endpoint that loads the lessons list. We want to make sure that only authenticated users with a valid session can access this data. This is different, for example, from the login route where we want to allow unauthenticated users to access it because they are not yet logged in. So we need to separate the extraction of the user ID from the request from the decision that we will take afterwards of giving or not access. Let's start with the first part, which is extracting the user. In order to extract the user from the request, we are going to be writing a custom express middleware, and we are going to see some common error situations that we might run into when we write this type of middleware. We are going to see some very common pitfalls. We're going to create here a new file and we're going to call it getUser, and we are going to give it a .middleware extension. So this is a normal express middleware that is going to take three parameters. The parameters are the request, the response, and the next function. We're going to learn how to use the next function in a moment. Let's first plug in this middleware. So the middleware is just a function. We're going to go here to the server TS. We are configuring our middleware, and let's see what would happen if we would plug in the middleware here. Let's put it here and then we will see what happens. Let's first then implement the middleware. This would look like the following. We are going to start by retrieving the JSON web token from the request. So we are going to define here a constant JWT, and accessing the request, we are going to retrieve the JSON web token from the cookie. So with this in place, we have here a string that corresponds to the JSON web token that we have created. We are going to see, does this JSON web token exist? Because there is the possibility that, for example, at application startup time, we don't have a session yet, or we have just logged out, so we have cleared the session cookie. So if we don't have an authentication token available, we're going to call the next function. And what this does is we are going to continue the chain of middleware. This means that if the user information is not present, we are not going to block the requests in this particular middleware. The request is going to travel further down the chain, then we will have a separate middleware to take the decision, can we access this route or not? Right now we are just extracting the user information. On the other hand, if the JWT exists, then we need to extract from it the user, because we might need to decode JSON web tokens in other parts of the application. Let's create here a function that we are going to simply call decode JWT, and we are going to pass it here our string. Now let's see how to implement this function. We are going to put it here at the level of security utils. So this is the only file in the program that is using a particular implementation of a JSON web token library. So if we would want to swap this library out, then this would be the only part of the program that we would need to change. We're going to create here the function. We are going to take in as input the JWT in string form. We're going to export the function and we're going to import it here. Because the decoding is also an asynchronous operation, we are going to go here and we are going to mark the function as async. Let's now create a variable here called payload, and we are going to rename this string parameter to token because JWT was already being used here for the JWT library. We are going to get the payload by calling verify on this JSON Web Token. Let's then pass it as input parameters the token in string form, and in order to verify it, we are going to pass it the public key. So as you can see, in this particular demo application, we are using the private key and the public key in the same code base, but nothing would prevent that the creation of the token would be done in a third-party server that is completely different from the server where we are running this REST API. And we're going to see how to do that further in the course. Let's then await for the resolution of this promise. So now we have here the payload. We could return it straight away. Instead, we are going to do here some logging just for debugging purposes. We're going to log the payload to the server console and we are going to return it. With this in place, we have decoded our JSON Web Token. So going back here to our middleware, we're going to create here a new asynchronous function. We're going to call it handle session cookie. And we are going to take the code that we have here. We are going to do it instead here inside this function. And we are going to do here an await so that we have here indeed the token itself. If there wasn't any error, we are going to see how to handle errors in this case. First, let's go here and let's call the session cookie by passing in this parameter. We will also be needing the request because we will need to store the user ID in the request. And assuming that this function here does proper error handling, we are going to call next here so that we are sure that the middleware chain will proceed. Actually, because we are calling next on both places, we're going to simplify this code here and we're going to call next only at the end. The idea here is to ensure that this middleware never blocks the request, so it tries to retrieve the user ID. If it cannot find it, the request will still continue to travel through the middleware chain and the decision to error out the request or not is going to be taken later in the chain. But there is a problem here. Try to spot it, we are going to fix it in a moment. Right now, here we have the payload, so this is not the token, this is the payload itself of the JSON Web Token. So inside we already have the subject. Let's quickly fix this compilation problem first. We need to pass in here the second argument, which is the request. So at this point, if we do payload.sub, this is going to contain the subject that we created here. We have specified here the subject as being the user ID. So going back to our middleware, this is why if we call payload.sub, we are going to get back the user ID. What we're going to do here is we are going to store it directly at the level of the request so that it's available downstream to the other middleware. So we are going to store it in a property called user ID and we are going to assign it the user ID taken from the JWT subject. Let's now quickly summarize what we have built here in this lesson. This is a global express middleware that is going to be applied to every request that this REST server will receive. We are going to try very early in the request chain to extract the user ID from the session cookie, which contains a JSON Web Token. So we are going to decode the JSON Web Token and extract the user ID and store it in the request. We are not yet deciding if we want to block this request or not. That will be done in a separate middleware. There are a couple of problems with this middleware implementation. There is here a subtle asynchronous programming issue that you are going to run into very often while coding in JavaScript, and also we need to take care of error handling. What if there was an error? What would have happened here? An error in this part of the program would risk blocking the whole application because this code is being applied to every single HTTP request.